Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Ola, thank you so much for joining The No Show and taking the time to be with us. First of all, can I sort of get you to start off by introducing yourself and a little bit of a background about you, so that my audiences can get a bit accustomed to what your work and what you do.
Right. Thank you very much, Hassan, for having me here. So I'm Olamide Samuel. I go by Ola for short. And my background in academic research is actually focused on national security strategy and international security overall. I'm not what you call a traditional academic in the sense of the word, in the sense that I sort of drifted into academia on a few observations that I made growing up in Nigeria. So I initially started off my academic journey by looking at international law and diplomacy, and looking at how international law can be leveraged to give some sort of order in the world, a way to mediate state interactions with each other. But over time, I discovered that perhaps some of the most divisive issues and case studies that we looked at had a lot to do with states essentially being very defensive and hostile with regards to anything that they perceived to be a threat to their national security. And this hostility was usually animated by the acquisition of, lots of military hardware, buying up lots of arms, small arms and light weapons, but also large conventional weapons, and in many cases, or in some notable cases, nuclear weapons. And so my exploration into international law eventually pushed me closer and closer to the concept of national security on the one hand, but also to the flow of weapons and how international law tries to control these weapons flows, but also how they try to constrain states' utilization of these weapons. And that's pretty much how I got to focusing on national security and arms control in my PhD thesis, and then lecturing this at SOAS, University of London, in the form of international security. I'm also an arms control activist, and so a lot of my work outside of academia is focused around trying to get states to be much more accountable and to be much more transparent in their purchasing and utilization of weapons, both nuclear and conventional. And so, that's how I got here.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, it's really refreshing to see that academics who are well versed in these subjects don't just study them, but actively, try to make change or try to sort of initiate the conversation about making change, which is like, typically in the past wasn't the case. And I've interviewed academics in the past who have sort of have made this argument that why are we as academics expected to not have a political activist voice? Why are we expected to be this neutral? But what does this neutral mean? And so it's really refreshing to see what you're doing. But I wanna go into, before we get into the details of the activism and stuff like that. I want to ask you about sort of growing up in Nigeria, and obviously Nigeria right now is dealing with its own issues with SARS and that sort of stuff. So could you sort of paint the scene to the political scene to our audience.
Okay, so brief background about Nigeria as a country and how we got to where we are with the uh, proliferation of violence, fire, the police, army, and SARS. Nigeria was a former British colony. We gained independence in 1960. And upon gaining independence, there were a number of things we inherited from the colonial administration. First of all was the precursor to what we now know as the Nigerian police force in its shape and form today. We had a sort of constabulary which was utilized by the British government at that time to enforce control over Nigerian territory. The second thing we inherited from the colonial administration was this loosely based confederate style of government, where the regions were much more important political centers than a central government. And this was all part of the British government's divide and rule strategy. And so how does this relate, to the End SARS movement today? Well, upon gaining independence, within 6 years of gaining independence, two of these dynamics flared up. First of all, the regional power centers, and second of all, an efficient repressive police force that was developed by the British to maintain control. And so in 1966, we had our first military coup. Because regional centers of political power were not satisfied with the political autonomy they were receiving in the center. In this case, the eastern region, political region, was very dissatisfied with the northern dominated political power structure at the center. And so we had a major at the time, who was Kaduna Ezogwu, who carried out a military coup and assassinated mostly northern and western political leaders in order to sort of establish a lot more political autonomy for the East. And this was perhaps one fatal mistake that led to the Nigerian Civil War less than a year later, because there was reprisal attacks from all corners of Nigeria, with Hausa soldiers from the north and Yoruba soldiers from the west carrying out reprisal attacks to install their man in the center. And it led to a free-for-all and a coup culture wherein you were much more likely to gain political control of the country via militarized means or via the assassination of the sitting leader than through due political process, through a democratic political process. But a byproduct of this struggle for power in the center, which was at the level of high politics, was that the average Nigerian and the average Nigerian's personal security and opportunities for progression economically and politically were much more determined by what ethnicity they are. Than by what merits or qualifications or qualities they have as an individual. And this led to the dislocation of many ethnic minorities. This led to, kerfuffles and struggles between the average Nigerian, seeing any other Nigerian that wasn't of the same ethnic grouping as him or herself as an enemy. And so there was always this sort of underlying political disturbance, incidences of riots, incidences of violence, crimes were on the rise. And the government, caught up in this whole struggle for the political center, did not really pay attention to the breaking down of law and order. And so over time, this law and order became so grave that it was very difficult to carry out, this breakdown of law and order became so grave that it was very difficult to carry out even just a financial transaction or any sort of administrative process without facing the very systemic, very entrenched, ugly face of corruption, without facing some sort of violence, without having to pay someone on the side to get a very simple thing done. And when the government became much more aware of this breakdown of law and order, well, they resorted to one tactic that they have known all along, which was to use the violent repression of use violent repression to maintain political order. And so our current president today, Muhammadu Buhari, was actually one of the first military leaders of Nigeria in the 1980s that really highlighted this trend I'm talking about. So he was a military dictator who ascended to political power via a coup, but who under his regime, economic processes, social processes, political processes have broken down to such an extent that he declared a war against indiscipline. And in this war against indiscipline, much like the war against terrorism, it was an open-ended free-for-all that gave the state the legitimacy it required to clamp down on anything it viewed as, reeking of indiscipline. And so we had soldiers and police officers who were authorized to use force to beat down warehouse owners who they claimed were hoarding products, for example, or who were hiking prices of products. And so the military repression and the military violence actually became much more domestic for a lot of individuals, for a lot of Nigerians, because the use of brute physical force was justified to deal with, problems that were inherently political and inherently bureaucratic. And so Nigerians have been socialized into this political system where everything could be solved by force. And it's at the same time a political system that is also almost wholly involved or wholly absorbed in the struggle for power at the political center. So the elites are doing their thing, trying to maintain their proximity to power. But whenever anything that looks like indiscipline flares up, they can just send out soldiers, send out police officers to go deal with whatever uprising that was happening. And so in 1992, Nigeria had a spike in armed robberies and burglaries and indiscipline, and they developed the SARS unit within the Nigerian police force. The SARS unit is an acronym for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. Mm-hmm. And the Special Anti-Robbery Squad were given extensive powers to investigate and clamp down on armed robbery. Now, over time, because the SARS was treated as a separate unit, an elite unit in the police force, over time they began to engage in the violent repression and oppression of citizens, and the extortion and the bullying and the murder of citizens for personal financial gain. And it became, much more systemic to the point that in 2016, late 2016, early 2017, every Nigerian had heard about SARS. If you were a young Nigerian, especially a young person, with a tattoo or having a laptop in their bag or anything that shows that you were, westernized or that you were financially affluent, they will target you as a legitimate target, saying that you were either a fraudster or you had stolen the wealth that allowed you to purchase something as basic as a laptop. And so young people were feeling very suffocated in this climate, and there's been lots of political activism to highlight the systemic decay of law and order in Nigeria, but also the violent repression of young citizens and the targeting of young citizens. And the most recent iteration of that happened in October of this year, where SARS crimes and SARS repression became so unbearable that Nigerians took to the streets, knowing the consequences, or at least knowing of potential consequences of taking to the streets in political protest. These Nigerians took to the streets to demand, for the 5th time in 5 years, the dissolution of SARS. Mm-hmm. And on the 11th of October, President Buhari, remember him from 1984, announced that, yes, he is going to disband SARS and that they're going to take away the leeway that these units have, take them up the streets and make them focus on more pressing issues like organized crime. But because this was the fourth time, at least in President Buhari's administration, that he had announced the disbandment or the solution of SARS, Nigerians didn't believe him.
Mm-hmm.
And so for 9 days after the 11th of October, Nigerians continued taking to the streets, politically organizing, and pressing their demands to the government that actually the dissolution of SARS is not enough. We need more political reform, more police reforms, and a much more credible, ethical judicial system. But on the 20th of October this year, the Nigerian government once again resorted to the same tactic they have used over and over. And in Lagos, at the Lekki tollgate on the 20th of October, while protesters were peacefully protesting, waving the Nigerian flag, the Nigerian military and other police units were deployed to the tollgate, and they opened live fire on protesters, killing at least 12 individuals. And the government has refused to acknowledge any of these killings took place at the hands of their officers. And so there's still a lot of political uprising that's going on around these killings. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, has been called in to investigate, and the Lagos state government, which is a state where the tollgate shootings happened, has opened a judicial panel of inquiry. But that's a story for another day. The core is, and this is something that's very similar to my findings, is that Nigeria's understanding of national security is so politically tainted that there is perhaps no limit to the sort of physical violence that the government would met out against its citizens through its organized police force, to quash any sort of political opposition or any sort of any sort of disturbances to the stability of the central regime. And that the Lekki massacre, as it's now known, is actually a product of this and not a byproduct, where the government remains wholly focused on control of political power in the center, but delegates with a very free hand the violent repression of any political dissent to specialized units within the army, within the police force, who don't feel accountable to anyone, domestically or internationally, and commit violence against citizens however they please. Very reminiscent of British colonial rule.
So the SARS unit of the police or squad or whatever you want to call them, are they politically aligned to a given party, or are they just politically aligned to just funding from the central government?
They owe their allegiance to whoever is in power at that point in time. And so the Nigerian police force, before independence, owed its allegiance to the British Governor General at the time, and then its allegiance switched to the first Prime Minister. And so these forces, including SARS, they don't necessarily have any political leanings towards parties. As long as a party can take over control of the center, well, their allegiance is to the continuation of the units via funding and proximity to power.
And constitutionally, is there a remedy for this? Like, because obviously, I'm telling you this because constitutionally we have the almost identical problems in Iraq, with the difference being that we don't have a specialized unit. The difference is that we have sort of a constitution that allows this leeway for certain abuses of power to happen. And so do you think that there is a remedy for this, or do you think that it's something that's become too ingrained in the political sphere in Nigeria?
So it's interesting that you bring up the constitution, because Nigeria over time has had four major revisions to its constitution. And at this point in time, we are acting under the 1999 Nigerian constitution. So that was the last time it had any overhaul. The interesting thing about Nigeria's constitutions is that through the strings of military dictatorships from 1966 all the way to 1998, these dictatorships came in and either suspended the constitution completely or sought to rewrite the entire constitution. So there were points in Nigeria's history where the the sovereign power was a federal military government, or a supreme military council, or a prime minister, or a president. And these constitutions, in their evolution, actually entrenched and enshrined the interests of those parties that were able to violently take over political power. And so when we talk about international law, and we talk about human rights and the right to peaceful assembly and the rights to political association, well, in Nigeria, there's overriding provisions that prioritize stability, prioritize mitigating or minimizing any sort of disruption to the country. And so these provisions were actually, introduced by military declarations, military acts, by individual leaders. And a lot of these things have actually been passed into the 1999 Constitution. So looking for remedies to this repression of political dissent within the Nigerian Constitution itself is actually a futile exercise. However, Nigeria is state parties to a lot of international treaties, agreements, and exist in a world where there's norms that have become crystallized over time that are meant to protect human rights in the individual. And one of these agreements Nigeria is party to is the Rome Statute, which essentially establishes international criminal prosecution and protects the rights of citizens, especially citizens that are protesting peacefully. Now, even though it might be difficult to propose political reform domestically, Nigeria is still constrained by the provisions of the Rome Statute. And so by going into a peaceful protest with a premeditated aim of shooting down protesters with live ammunition goes against and is a grave violation of the Rome Statutes. And that is why people have called for international criminal court investigation. But again, like the Nigerian Constitution, international criminal court investigation isn't something that can effectively deter the government from carrying out repressive activities. As a matter of fact, the government has carried out much more grievous violations of the Rome Statute in recent years. Heard of Boko Haram, the terrorist organization in the northeast of Nigeria? Well, when Boko Haram, disintegrated into a full-blown insurgency, many parts of northeast Nigeria were put under emergency legislation, under a state of emergency. And according to Amnesty International and according to a lot of other civil society organizations and humanitarian organizations on the ground, there were grave violations carried out against human rights, both to bystanders or to sympathizers of Boko Haram. And at the face of it, it doesn't seem like a big deal. There was a war going on, there was an insurgency. But why is it permitted that a government can summarily execute and flatten villages that they suspect of being sympathetic to the political aims of an insurgent group? They're not taking active part in the insurgency. And if there's a suspicion, perhaps these people have the right, not perhaps, they do have the right to face due process. They do have the rights to be investigated and put through the judicial system. It shouldn't be that the state can go in there and carry out extrajudicial killings. And so the International Criminal Court, at least since 2015, almost once every year, has had a reason to open preliminary investigations into the Nigerian government, right? But the thing about the International Criminal Court is that there's the principle of complementarity. And this principle states that, a state must be unwilling or unable to prosecute crimes against humanity for that state to then be under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And the Nigerian government has recognized that, in the carrying out of these crimes against humanity, they are liable to be placed under the jurisdiction of the ICC. But they've also found a way to evade this jurisdiction by opening internal investigations into these killings. So the ICC can come in and say, it's alleged that your soldiers killed, 3,000 people, which is very close to what happened in Baga in northeast Nigeria. And the Nigerian government could say, all right, well, we are going to look into this. We've opened investigations and we are going to prosecute these soldiers who are ours for these crimes they carried out. At that point, the government has demonstrated a willingness to prosecute crimes against humanity. And so they have evaded International Criminal Court jurisdiction. And there's no provision that it serves as a sort of follow-up where the International Criminal Court can then make a decision on the basis of the outcome of the investigation the Nigerian government carries out. So what the Nigerian government has done since 2015 is they open an investigation, they open a closed investigation wherein there's no independent observers, and then they have findings that they do not circulate to the international community. And in these findings, recommendations for prosecution, recommendations for sanctions against individuals or groups that carried out these crimes against humanity. But we've noticed that after these recommendations are reached, these conclusions are reached, nobody actually gets prosecuted for these crimes against humanity. And so Nigeria has efficiently found a way to evade ICC jurisdiction by literally burying things under the carpet. And so when we look at End SARS and the killings of protesters in 2020, there's a very clear trajectory that's occurring, where Nigeria has now opened internal investigations into the shootings that occurred at the toll gates in October. But there was a botch to the Nigerian government's gambit, and that was that these investigations were meant to be closed. And so anyone that wanted to testify at the investigations had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and there was no press to be allowed. But then this discovery led to more and more protests, and now the Nigerian government has waived the requirement to sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to take part in the internal investigations. And so the BBC, CNN, and other international news agencies are now following these proceedings very closely. Well, time will tell whether or not the government will be held accountable for the very first time in what has been an incredibly long time for crimes against humanity. But perhaps the outcome of this shooting and the global outcry that it created might begin to shift the militarized culture of national security strategy of Nigeria towards what we all hope would become a human security focused strategy.
You presented an extremely thorough and very well explained synthesis of what's happening with regards to Nigeria, and you pointed to quite a few things. In particular, one of the things that stood out to me was the fact that the police force is still sort of influenced by its colonial past, and I can't help but notice, like through these investigations, that past still exists, because it's a very British tactic to sort of say we're going to hold these investigations. Oh, but by the way, they're secret, and we can't really, and we will redact a lot of what's on there. So to me, it seems like the Nigeria, as well as many other places in sort of the global south, haven't essentially figured out a form of democracy that actually works post-colonialism. And how does Nigeria move from here? How does Nigeria um, how do you reform this?
So it's a very good spot you made, because Nigeria is not alone in retaining very efficiently a lot of the repressive tactics of that they inherited from colonial times. But I must say that, like many countries in the global south, what Nigeria is essentially a contraption, a territorial contraption that forces very different nations and tribes and ethnicities to coexist without the option of developing nation states in the way that they've been organically developed in Europe from the 15th to the 17th centuries. You know, there's just something very primal about the connection between ethnicities and a nation state, or the development of a nation state in its formative years. And so, when wars were carried out between 15th to 17th century in Europe, they were carried out in ways that created, as a byproduct, many of the administrative functions that we now see the state providing today. In order to wage wars, local lords, local barons, local leaders had to find a way to effectively mobilize individuals within their territories and organize them in ways that they'll be an efficient fighting force. They also had to find ways to economically sustain their war efforts in order to expand their territories, in order to gain more resources. And so this is how the system of taxation, the system of levies, the systems of organized armies were organically developed. But mind you, they were developed over hundreds of years. And, we had states that survived, such as France, Prussia, the United Kingdom, or the British Empire, but we also had states that never survived, such as Burgundy, which is now known as a color. But in Nigeria's case, and in many of the countries in the global south, well, their fates were determined for them during the Scramble of Africa, when borders were drawn in faraway lands in Berlin. And, these borders were then to be enforced as sovereign territories, wherein these very different ethnic and tribal groups had to find a way to then create a national identity that wasn't on the basis of ethnicities or tribes or kinship, without the option to perhaps create new state entities, that perhaps much more reflected the ideological and ethical and ethnic goals of a particular peoples. And so that is what Nigeria is, a contraption of hundreds of distinct nations. Now, we can't propose the redrawing of territorial borders in the global south, because countries have been established and they now have recognition. There's the principle of sovereignty and the inviolability of borders, and any attempt to break up a country is seen as a secessionist attempt, and ultimately always leads to civil war.
But
so it means that,
no, sorry, just to cut you off. With that said, surely it's still possible. Surely it's still done. And life would even if there's an initial phase of war or initial phase in some kind of uprising or whatever, surely things will level off at some point. Is that a cost that is worth making?
So yes, I was highlighting the initial phases of war that these countries have had to essentially skip. And I'm definitely not advocating any sort of conflicts as the means now. But yes, we expect that these things should level off over time. So Nigeria today, for example, is very demographically different from Nigeria 40 years ago. Lots of interethnic marriages, lots of people that just tell you, I'm Nigerian because my dad is from this tribe, my mom is from this tribe, and goes on 2, 3 generations. And so they don't have such an attachment to ethnic allegiances anymore. There's also the spread of education and awareness about the importance of political ideology and how that is an overriding factor in determining and negotiating common national destiny. And so countries like Nigeria have to invest very heavily um, in political processes that exist in order to make them much more equitable, fair, and representative of the mosaic of opinions and political inclinations that exist within them. But the violent repression from central governments, you can see that all around Africa, isn't actually moving the needle in a positive direction. In the sense that this atmosphere of fear, repression, and of a fear of expressing political dissent is actually harming this organic development of a much more representative and inclusive democratic society. So if people can't really express their political grievances peacefully, how is the democratic process expected to work? You know, in the most efficient sense. And that's one side of the debate. These countries have to figure out ways to enhance political cohesion over time. The second side of the debate is that a lot of these central governments that hold power in a lot of third world states are still perpetuating a patron-client relationship with former colonial masters. So Nigeria, for one, is still heavily entangled with the United Kingdom. It's its largest trading partner. Over 60% of its oil exports make it to the United Kingdom. Why is this? Considering that there are much more competitive options the world over. Well, there's interest to continue to perpetuate the preferential treatment of British interests within Nigerian territory. And so we've had governments over time that continue to offer concessions, especially with our oil reserves, to the United Kingdom's government. But in return, what these former colonial masters offer these central governments is the longevity of power, the stability of their rule. And this is where the arms trade comes in. Now, given that SARS or all of these other military units have engaged in human rights violations against individuals, one would expect that perhaps a country like the United Kingdom or a lot of European Union countries would refrain from continually arming the governments that use these arms to kill their citizens. Matter of fact, they are constrained by law to not sell arms to countries like Nigeria. If they have any indication that there's a risk that these arms will be used against civilians. It's in the Arms Trade Treaty in Articles 6 and 7. Article 6.3 explicitly states that a party to the Arms Trade Treaty cannot export these arms. What we see is a continuation of arms exports, regardless of the cost, because these former colonial masters or countries understand how important the provision of these arms to these juntas are for the continuation of this preferential treatment and preferential access to resources all around Africa. And so we have a dynamic where, first of all, national security, poorly interpreted, is stifling democratic processes. But national security, in its poor interpretation, is still being assisted by foreign powers, because these foreign powers are providing the tools through which these central governments can multiply their use of force. The more efficient the weapon system is, the more you can multiply the use of force, the more you can repress any sort of political dissent. And so the development of democratic processes in the third world and the arms trade are actually intimately interlinked. For example, apart from the 1.9 trillion spent on military expenditure last year, around 51 million pieces of small arms or light weapons are in circulation in Africa. And the largest exporters of arms to Africa are the United States, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, then Serbia and China.
Mm-hmm.
Of notable importance is France's involvement and the United Kingdom's involvement, because there have been developments of, I would say, legal contraptions within the EU that are supposed to make the export of arms to these countries much more efficient. The European Defence Fund, for example, which went largely unnoticed in the public eye, is meant to be a heavy multi-year investment into research and development to make arms production much more efficient. Mm-hmm. And France has been spearheading that within the EU. Well, now back to Africa. There's been an exponential increase of the number of arms being exported year on year to Africa since 2001. And that number almost doubled from 2014 to 2015. And there's also been lots of correlation between the pumping in of arms into Africa and the propensity for violent conflict. Mm-hmm. Now that 51 million number of arms I talked to you about before, I'm going to throw a quick question back to you. How many of these arms do you think are controlled by states out of 51 million weapons?
You'd hope that it's a large amount if it's a reasonably run state.
In Africa, state parties account for the ownership of around 11 million of these small arms and light weapons.
Wow. So which means the rest is held by who?
Non-state parties. So, regional groups, political organizations, militias, and individuals hold 40 million weapons in Africa.
So then that sort of like begs the question: who's selling them the weapons?
Precisely. Now, over 90% of the weapons in private ownership in Africa today originated from state stockpiles. Over 90%.
Wow.
So, most of the weapons found in South Sudan between 2011 and 2016 were actually sent from France to Cote d'Ivoire, who then re-exported them to South Sudan. And so the ownership sort of disperses when one gun leaves one stockpile to another, to another, to another. France exporting its weapons to Cote d'Ivoire knows fully well that there must be a statement in its export licenses for the end user and the end use. It must be explicitly stated who the end user is and what the end use might be. And the onus is on France to determine via a very elaborate risk analysis that this end user and end use is going to be, in fact, the end user and end use. And France is as aware as many other researchers are in the field that there is this whole dynamic of diversion from national stockpiles into the hands of private militias and private organizations, but they still continue to send these weapons and are even looking for much more efficient ways to make the production.
But I'm sure these European states like the UK, France, Italy, perhaps, and all these states that do sell weapons, I'm sure like they don't. The legal requirement is some bullshit that they've come up with to sort of cover themselves and propose to the world that, hey, look, we've done our part, we're just selling to another state. How much of that is like how much of what they say is legal actually holds any weight?
Very little, very, very little. Because, for example, the Arms Trade Treaty requires that before any export, the risk analysis that should be carried out should be an analysis of the trends of use. So not just how Cote d'Ivoire, for example, utilized weapons in 2014. No, they're supposed to look at how did they utilize it in the past 10 years or so. Where did these weapons eventually end up? So that is still part of France's requirement, for example. The
Mm-hmm.
United Kingdom is another, state party to the ATT that blatantly violates its Article 6 and 7 obligations. We often hear about the UK arming Saudi and these arms being used in Yemen.
Yep.
Well, there's been at least 4 high-profile law cases brought against the United Kingdom's government, wherein they were required to answer for why they have continued the exports to Saudi Arabia in light of the crimes against humanity that have occurred. And the United Kingdom continues to maintain that its risk assessments do not lead it to the conclusion that its arms are going to be deliberately used by Saudi Arabia for the commission of war crimes in Yemen, regardless of international Red Cross opinion, international criminal court opinion. And so it's like, who's going to hold the states accountable?
But but the thing is, it's like, take that aside, take this legal jargon aside, and on all this legal bullshit that these states put forward. Should it be our expectation, or should we be managing our expectations about the role of these governments and how actually they are essentially very organized? They're taking part in very organized crime. Like, for example, the British are openly selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, who are explicitly, have bombed Yemen into oblivion. And they've bombed famine into Yemen. So should we be looking at the picture with a bit of reality check and say, actually, hold on, we know this is all bullshit, and we need to change our tone and how we sort of discuss this issue?
So I think it's important to have both an optimistic and a realistic assessment of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
In the first place, having a realistic assessment of the situation, which is what academics are expected to have, really enables us to understand what the specific interests are that drive states like the UK or like France to make these heinous decisions,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because by a clearer understanding of these interests, then people that utilize the conclusions of this understanding can better target their activism towards these interests, right? But on the other hand, we must have an optimistic outlook in the sense that even though the states are violating the letter of the law today, there must be a continuous pressure there must be continuous pressure put on them to ensure that they oblige to international norms and laws that they have explicitly signed up to. Because if we decide to only take the realistic, interest-centric, power-centric approach to analyzing the situation, who's going to hold these states morally accountable? It must remain on record that there is a moral obligation in addition to the legal obligation for these states to improve their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and with that sort of talk of activism, can you sort of give us a bit of a background about how you got involved with the activism that you're currently doing?
Okay, so I got involved in activism because of the conclusions that my research was always drawing me to. So, coming from a national security background, it's quite odd that I would be engaging in arms control activism because of the culture of national security studies that are supposed to take this cold, calculated, rational approach to state behavior. But, if national security is about efficiently protecting all citizens within a particular state, then how this national security is provided is just as important. And so, if a national security that is provided by only military means is inefficient and actually harms the citizens of the state, then we must consider other alternatives to providing national security. And so, focusing on human security and on the threat matrix that an individual human experiences makes us to understand that actually health security, food security, water security are much more important determinants of the efficiency of the provision of national security.
That's a really, really interesting point. The fact that national security is synonymous with terrorism and weapons and, you know, war. How come, you know, there's no mention of food security and health security and all that kind of stuff? So elaborate on that, please.
Yes, so precisely, national security has been hijacked by a militaristic understanding. And the individual human has been left out as the prioritized reference object. And this is because, you know, national security over time has been culturally accepted as the rationale to purchase more weapons, has become synonymous with the decision to go to war, has also become synonymous with secrecy. Okay, so when states are avoiding accountability and they invoke national security as a reason why they can't divulge certain information, it's a convenient way for states to avoid accountability. And different states around the world have learned this and understood this and have incorporated this very limited militaristic understanding of national security as militaristic. And so they've continued to perpetuate that because it's convenient for the retention of power. So when we hear about terrorism, for example, or we hear about global war on terror, for example, and we look to terrorist occurrences that have happened the world over, or even in a particular country, if we look at the loss of life that has occurred from terrorist incidents and contrast that to the loss of life that has occurred from medical malpractice in any calendar year, for example, medical malpractice or any other thing like car accidents or other threats by far outweigh terrorism as a predominant as a predominant threat to human life within a particular country. But states still prioritize the terrorist and the anti-terrorist narrative because of something called securitization. In the sense that when a state wants to enjoy much more free reign to exercise their power over a particular issue, what we've noticed in international security is that the states begin a process of securitization. So they point to a particular subset of the population, for example, and say, this particular borough, this particular religion, they're much more threatening to the state, right? And they're like, these particular languages and these particular orientations, ideologies are also threatening. And we need to prioritize and deal with this before it destroys everything as we know it.
Yeah.
And so they escalate an issue and label the term security on that issue in order for it to be given priority within the political processes. And so when we talk about terrorism acts and national security acts and even the prevent strategy of the United Kingdom, these are ways in which, or these are the results of the securitization of a subset of people. Now, isn't it interesting that when we talk about terrorism, the almost instant synonymous, or the almost instant association we make is Islamist terrorism.
Yeah.
This is as a result of the targeted political attachment of the religion in itself to a tactic of warfare that has been used by very many groups over the years. So, for example, there's been many terrorist occurrences in the United States that have been carried out by white individuals or by nationalist organizations, but they're never called terrorist attacks. They're called lone wolf attacks, or they're blamed on the psychological health of the individual that carried it out. They're never necessarily labeled with a terrorist label. And it just goes to show that, national security, and by extension, the concept of terrorism, can be and is routinely politically charged. There are benefits to securitizing something and taking it out of the realm of normal politics, so that these states that securitize an issue, such as terrorism, can now deal with that issue outside of the public eye. And they slap on the label of national security, so they don't have to divulge information with regards to how they dealt with that issue.
I mean, so that's a really that's a really fantastic way of sort of breaking down national security as a sort of as an overarching theme. So tell us a bit more about the campaign that you guys have launched.
So the campaign, the Freeze Weapons campaign, essentially is a recognition that perhaps we need to look a lot more at human security of individuals. And so this year, as the world became much more aware of the dangers posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the UN Secretary General, called for a global ceasefire to all conflict in the world because of the emerging coronavirus and because of the dangers that were foreseen because of the dangers that were foreseen as a result of the coronavirus. And so, upon the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, my team and I at Scrap Weapons in SOAS carried out research with regards to what a global ceasefire would mean for our preparedness to respond to a global pandemic such as COVID-19. And that is what we discovered, looking at military expenditure, that the world had overwhelmingly funded militaries and military expenditure over time, and significantly underfunded the provision of healthcare. And so something like almost $2 trillion was spent on military expenditure in the 2019 calendar year, which is over 600 times the annual budget of the World Health Organization. And we thought this relationship was quite significant because in the face of limited resources for states, perhaps if they were prioritizing human security, they would take the threats that this virus poses to individuals as much more significant because of the potential loss of life than they were. And they would fund these initiatives and fund healthcare infrastructure in order to reflect this understanding. But as we've seen, states have not only continued to spend on military expenditure, they've also still left healthcare infrastructure pretty much the way it is. States have instead focused on finding stopgap or immediate solutions to dealing with the virus that will be completely flattened or completely unmitigated if we were to find, or if there were to be the emergence of another virus. So states have focused on big pharma, have focused on the introduction of a vaccine, but healthcare infrastructure is still significantly underfunded all over the world. And so what happens if we get a COVID-20 or a completely different virus that completely bypasses whatever protection a vaccine would provide? We'll be back in the same situation we were thrown in the beginning of this year. And so we're calling on states to actually divert in a focused manner spending that it has prioritized for military expenditure and utilize that diverted fund to enhance healthcare infrastructure in many ways. And so the Freeze campaign essentially shows states, gives a lot of examples to which states can follow to divest military expenditure into healthcare provision. And at its core, the Freeze campaign is a legal campaign as well, in the sense that we are proposing that states can take the first step into divesting from military expenditure into healthcare expenditure by pausing the production, trade, and supply of weapons for as long as it takes to be able to invest in a more robust healthcare infrastructure. And so the freeze campaign has something called the freeze moratorium, which is a legal text that a state can modify to its own ends to pause the waste of funds into military expenditure and actually free up resources to invest in things like the NHS, for example, in the United Kingdom. As part of the campaign, we reached out to the United Nations Secretary General, we reached out to the Pope, and we reached out to a lot of civil society organizations, including the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And we got overwhelming support for this initiative. And so now that we've gotten the political support from these different quarters, we are now pushing these legal texts in different countries for parliamentarians and for political representatives to table in parliament so that states can begin to figure out ways of pausing the arms trade, pausing the expenditure on weapons, and actually looking at ways to bolster our resilience to a potential COVID-20 or whatever future virus they may be.
I'm wondering, did you guys do some kind of like economic modeling about the impact this would have on the economy too? Because I can't help but think, okay, we stop, because one of the major arguments about the lockdown was that, hold on, why we shouldn't be locking down. What we should have done is we should have had increased our capacity in hospitals. So regardless of how many people are infected, we can still, service them in our hospitals. So economically speaking, the freeze on these arms trade and the increase in the capacity would ultimately lead to an economy that continues to go without having all these pauses. So I'm wondering, did you guys model this in any way?
So we didn't do the initial modeling precisely because there have been so many different models that have proved the point you've raised, which is a much more robust healthcare infrastructure, much more robust governance structures have an overwhelmingly positive effect on the overall health of an economy, as opposed to developments in military expenditure. And so instead of reinventing the wheel, what we tried to do was really translate existing research, many of which are well known by state authorities, translate these into digestible information for the general public to understand. Because without pressure from the general public, it will be impossible to get these states to even consider the outcome of these research. And you're right, again, by highlighting that perhaps our lack of preparedness for a pandemic such as this had much more dire economic impact on the United Kingdom, for example. Because when we look at countries like Sweden, which have significantly invested in their healthcare capacity, they never had to lock down, and they never reached critical capacity in their hospital wards because there was surplus or at least adequate healthcare infrastructure in place. And so they never had to shut down. They suffered very minimal economic interruption in comparison with the rest of the EU. And life continued to go on in Sweden. The associated costs of the COVID pandemic, which is a massive spike in mental health issues and a massive spike in domestic violence, which we've recorded in the UK. Well, these things were not recorded in Sweden because the infrastructure was already in place. Therefore, lockdown was not necessary. Therefore, the physical and mental challenges that would face an individual in a lockdown did not manifest into the violent repercussions that we're seeing in the United Kingdom. So it's all interlinked at the end of the day.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ola, where can people find you online?
Absolutely. So you can find the team at scrapweapons.com. And you can find me at Olamide DIY. That's OLAMIDE DIY on all platforms. And on my personal and company profiles, we have links directly to the Freeze Weapons campaign and to our original research. So definitely check us out, and I follow back.
And how do people contribute or help support the Freeze campaign?
So, the support from individuals and organizations was overwhelming. And I think the most impactful type of support was actually sharing our material, engaging with the material and sharing it on to wider audiences. So we had organizations that translated the campaign material, had organizations that took our original research and made even more infographics. We had some that were lobbying parliamentarians and politicians to introduce freeze moratoria, such as the EDM 984 in the UK House of Commons. And so it was this how do I call it, snowball generation of allies that was the most important form of support that we received.
That's fantastic to see that people do get behind this, and organizations in different places, especially because it's such a universal issue. It's really interesting to see that. So I definitely urge anyone listening to this to get behind this, because this is a campaign this is a very human campaign at its heart. It's about humanity as opposed to an individual political organization or such. So I think it's amazing the work that you guys are doing, and we'll definitely do everything in our power to support and get behind it. Ola, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Honestly, I can say I've learned so much from you in the past hour or so. You've been fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me, and I must definitely give you guys a shout out. It's amazing the work you're doing, translating so much valuable research and work that's been carried out and making it accessible for the wider audience. I think it's really incredible the work you're doing.
I appreciate
look
that.
forward.
I definitely appreciate the kind words. Thanks. Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.